Domain 3 is bias or internal validity, and the purpose here is to assess the risk of bias in the study. What is risk of bias? It's what people call a systematic error, as opposed to random error, which happened by chance, or measurement error, which arose because there was some problems with accuracy, precision, or sampling error in terms of where the sample was taken or when it was taken. This happens because of design, and this could be conscious or unconscious. And there are various types of biases here. Selection bias is where eligible participants are excluded. For example, this is mainly applicable in observational studies. Due to selection of participants, some eligible participants who should have been included in the studies were excluded. Then there is what's called a confounding bias, where there are baseline imbalances in prognostic factors between the groups. Then you have the performance bias, which are systematic differences in co-interventions between the groups. Then you have the deduction bias, which are systematic differences in the measurement of outcomes between the groups. Then you have this attrition bias, which are systematic differences in the exclusion of participants after being initially included. In selection bias, you do not have them included at all. They are completely missing. Whereas in attrition bias, after including some participants initially, you are actually excluding them. And the attrition bias is, of course, applicable in both observational and experimental studies. Then you have the selective outcome reporting bias, which is covered shortly. Okay, what's selective outcome reporting? Authors do lots of analysis and selectively report results that favor the intervention. Okay, they do lots of different methods of analysis, and they report what's statistically significant. They do lots of subgroup analysis and report specific subgroup analysis, which showed a statistically significant difference. Selective reporting outcome bias should, as a minimum, cover whether the choice of results to be reported were predetermined. And that includes tables, text, figures. Which results would you report? Now, changing the outcomes is prevalent in human clinical trials, and there are no studies that investigate the prevalence of changing the outcomes in preclinical research. However, one can expect that it is at least as prevalent in preclinical research as clinical research. And it's now possible to register preclinical studies at www.preclinicaltrials.eu and www.osf.io before the study starts, which can help with the assessment of selective outcome reporting bias. Okay. So the question 3.1 is, did the authors minimize the risks of bias such as selection bias, confounding bias, performance bias, deduction bias, attrition bias, and selective reporting outcome bias? Now, some sources, for example, the examples and rationale for the risk of bias in animal studies are available in the Circle's risk of bias assessment tool for animal research. You also have examples in National Research Council's guidance of description of animal research in scientific publications, the US National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Strokes call for transparent reporting, and NIH's principles and guidelines for reporting preclinical research. So there are lots of sources. We are not going to go into how similar or how different these sources are, but broadly, you want to find out whether these differences between groups could have occurred. In some situations, the ISO standards and national toxicology program recommendations may also be applicable if you are looking at toxicology studies, for example. Okay, classify this as yes or probably yes if the study authors minimize the risk of bias in the study. So, for example, they performed randomization, which ensures that similar type of subjects were included in both the groups. They used blinding. They reported the protocol, registered the protocol in one of the sites that we mentioned. It could be other sites as well. So somewhere, and they refer to the protocol in the final report and so on. So they have included all the participants in the study. So so classify this as yes or probably yes if the study authors minimize the risk of bias in the study. Classify this as no information if it was not clear if the risk of bias in the study was clear or unclear. Okay, so so if you are not sure if the risk of bias in the study, for example, you don't know whether there were people or subjects excluded from the analysis, then you would put it as unclear. You are not clear that blinding was done, then you would put it as unclear for the risk of bias. In that situation, you can classify this as no information. Classify this as no or probably no if there is a high risk of bias in one of more domains. So if at least one domain is classified as a high risk of bias, then you would classify this as no or probably no.